Hello there. According to a high-ranking former army commander, the defence autonomy of the UK is under threat from the EU even after the UK leaves the Brexit Implementation Period. Firstly, please subscribe and like this video to give my channel a boost, and I'm always uploading new content, so please do check back daily. For those that think the only matter up for negotiation in the Brexit talks is trade, well, I have news for you. The EU not only wants the UK on an ECJ-controlled level playing field, it also wants the UK armed and security forces under EU Commission control. And according to Lt Gen Jonathon Riley, it's all laid out as a trap for the unwary in the political declaration agreed between the EU and UK as part of the Withdrawal Agreement treaty. In his piece called Weakening Our Defences, Dangers in the Political Declaration for a website called Briefings for Britain, formerly known as Briefings for Brexit, he says, "Most people think defence is not part of the EU negotiations, but it is very much in the frame, due to several lines in the political declaration, the text which guides the talks over the future relationship." Now, the first thing to point out is that the EU defence structure is made up of about 20 different bodies and is of labyrinthine complexity. You only have to take a look at it to find an absolute alphabet soup of Common Foreign and Security Policy, the CFSP, the Common Security and Defence Policy, CSDP, European Defence Agency, EDA, Permanent Structured Cooperation, PESCO, and the European Union Satellite Centre, EUSC. And the second is that the original political declaration that envisaged the UK's full participation in these EU defence programmes was put together by pro-EU Westminster mandarins, and it seems that they still have control over this aspect of the talks. And the third point is that none of the politicians are ever given the full picture, so allowing defence integration between the EU and UK to continue even after we leave the Brexit Implementation Period on the 31st of December this year. The fourth point is that the EU will not tolerate UK participation without UK forces being under full EU Commission control, not UK control. And the really big fifth point is that a country that has its military and defence controlled by another country is very obviously not a sovereign and independent nation state. It is merely a colony whose foreign policy, at the very least, is dictated from the outside. And those who think this doesn't matter must be under the erroneous impression that the defence and security policy needs of the UK are exactly the same as those of all EU member states like Italy, Estonia and Germany. And Lt Gen Riley says in his 10-point assessment of the defence section of the Brexit situation that apart from trade there are vital defence elements too in the political declaration which it is dangerous to overlook, for they risk being seriously damaging to UK interests. And the main problem here, as the author says, is that no one's talking about this, neither pundits, nor politicians, nor media. And another problem is that since the UK voted to leave the EU, Brussels has decided that without the UK to get in the way, defence amalgamation in the EU could be accelerated. And accelerated it has been. But this has been done while we are still intertwined with the EU, which carries the risk we could end up being permanently connected as a subservient force. Especially if our ministers, who have little or no understanding of this complex area, were to blindly follow the advice of civil servants whose sole aim over the years has been to reduce UK defence to a mere department inside an EU defence structure. Now, Lt Gen Riley does say that the Boris Johnson administration has listened to the warnings, so it changed the wording in the political declaration to remove the concept of UK forces immediately coming under the EU defence structure to one of "we'll consider it." But as he says in his article, however, this new approach brings an obvious risk of producing the same outcome, not least because ministers who are still unaware of the detail of EU defence are inclined to ask for advice from the wrong people, namely the small group of government officials who were involved in designing UK involvement in EU defence under May and were selected for that purpose. And he goes on to say later that the fact remains that no salaried official on the Brexit side of the argument has the sole task of understanding the EU defence architecture, despite its size and political significance for the current government. Therefore, the current process in which the government considers attachment is back in the hands of the officials who engineered May's intended commitment. And these, it seems, form a very small group of officials that possess the required EU defence architecture knowledge to keep this integration on track without alarming the politicians they're meant to serve. And as Lt Gen Riley says, bringing the UK to the brink of being perpetually under EU defence decision-making is a vast and complicated task. It is difficult to see how it could have been conceived and carried out without a controlling influence from the officials who actually understood the subject rather than the ministers who did not. And the author says that Boris Johnson must be encouraged to veer away from any attachment to EU defence structures, but that it is unrealistic to expect non-government MPs to help in this endeavour, because inadequate or incorrect briefings have made them a part of the problem. Sad indictment. Anyhow, Lt Gen Riley says that the public and key decision makers must be made aware of this, and that the current implementation period carries the risk of being the regulatory bridge to military unification, if so used by those that wish it to come about. When what we do need is a blank canvas, not a pre-made integration. And hopefully that will be the outcome of the insertion into the political declaration of the UK and EU now considering military co-structure, and not it being set in stone definitely. I'm also slightly reassured by the wording in the political declaration where it says, "With a view to Europe's security and the safety of their respective citizens, the parties should establish a broad, comprehensive and balanced security partnership. The partnership will respect the sovereignty of the United Kingdom and the autonomy of the Union." But this is not legally binding, just a negotiating guideline. So we could end up being quietly tied to a defence union with Brussels via a later treaty, unless we keep our eyes wide open. Now, Lt Gen Riley ends with a section on what the ministers need to know. And the first of his points here is that any amount of structured UK involvement in the EU defence architecture, including its defence industrial bodies, brings an obligation to follow EU defence policy. Of course it does. The EU will only operate militarily for its own ends and under its own command. If we're tied into it, then ergo we're under EU command and can only operate when the EU wants us to. The next point he brings up is that the EU is not offering ad hoc involvement in EU defence bodies. It is offering attachment on the same basis and with the same expectations as member states. This means full compliance with the EU as described in the defence parts of the EU treaties, directives and EU Council agreements. Brussels, as ever, would want the full Monty. And the third point affects both our defence autonomy and also our own defence industry through the procurement process and the concept of best value, which takes no account of national need. The UK defence industry has already lost domestic contracts because of this, including large ones like the building of Royal Fleet Auxiliary ships. On this, the author says, UK attachment to EU defence industrial bodies is not an advantage to UK industry, but rather an impediment because of the rules, benchmarks and strategies the EU imposes. Basically, it would tie the UK down to suppliers and builders over which it has no choice or say, and also ties us into certain EU-only compatible equipment. And on this, Lt Gen Riley says, "It is important to mention this subject because ministers' understanding of the defence industry dimension could ultimately be decisive in whether the UK participates in the whole EU defence architecture." Now, the implications do go wider. We've already had concerns over our defence relationship with the US and the Five Eyes intelligence network because of the UK government's bizarre obsession with getting the Chinese state-controlled tech giant Huawei involved with our new 5G comms network. Integrating our forces into the EU structure might also bring out the same concerns. Now, I might be wrong, but as I read it, military integration with the EU, even on a small scale, is not a definite yet. Nothing's been signed. But the risk is that while our open negotiations and ministers' attentions are focused purely on trade and things like fishing, how the UK defends itself could be quietly negotiated away behind closed doors. We must therefore stay alert to save our armed and security services so that we can always defend ourselves and save our own lives if required. And just a little bit on Lt Gen Riley's credentials. He was Deputy Commander of the NATO-led International Security Assistance Force in Afghanistan. He also commanded British forces in Bosnia, Sierra Leone and Iraq. Anyway, if you want to hear more from me, please don't forget to subscribe and also press that little bell, or you won't get any notifications. And if you want to see more of me, buy a mug with my mug on it. So, what do you think about this possible military integration? Please share and comment, and thank you for watching.